That's really the whole point of today. It's a bit of an experiment, and I haven't tried this with this particular system. So you may have to speak loudly or say things a couple times to ensure that I hear you if you're trying to interrupt, but I very much encourage it. So just to start with a little bit of an overview of the project that I'm working on, which is also the reason for the webinar. So as Stefan already mentioned, in partnership with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which is an operating foundation based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a focus on land policy research and practice, the Urban Institute is undertaking a scan of transatlantic peer learning activities with an even more specific focus on those that dealt with older industrial cities. This scan is then intended to inform some initial analysis about the field, including where there may be need for additional work, additional funding, additional support. So in terms of methodology for this program, I guess I would describe this program not in any way as sort of serious quantitative research. It's really more of a light touch project at this stage. There may be room for second phases or third phases that are more in depth, but at this point, the methodology really consists of online research of relevant activities that have taken place over, I'd say, the past 15 to 20 years, as well as interviews with a select number of organizers of those activities, as well as participants. When I first talked to my colleagues at the Urban Institute about this project, my reaction was, of course, that this was interesting, but also that a scan of all peer learning activities over a 2-decade period would be impossible or close to impossible. There would simply be too many, and they would be too difficult to identify and track down. Especially if you consider that if you really go back 2 decades, that almost takes us back to the early days of the internet. And so sometimes it's hard to track things down. But then we talked about it in more detail, and we decided that we were really interested in exploring was not a scan of every single one-off trip that a mayor or a department head may have taken to another city. Not that those aren't important, but that we were really interested in those peer learning opportunities that were part of a larger, more sustained program focused on peer learning. So the types of exchanges that we looked at, we have them listed here. So conferences, of course. Now I will say conferences tend to be one-off occasions, but they were large enough in scale in certain instances that we included them in any case. Study tours, workshops, online platforms and other networks, research fellowships for practitioners, studio programs or exchanges for students, and joint research among academic institutions and researchers. Again, what was not included were one-off exchanges that were not part of a larger sustained program. However, what we did end up including was programming that did not specifically target older industrial cities, but included enough older industrial cities to seem relevant. So before I get into what I've described here as initial observations, I really want to emphasize that these are not yet what I would consider findings, but instead these are things that we've noticed in putting together our scan, or ideas that have been shared with us in our various interviews. And so I'm actually presenting these to you today really as hypotheses. And I want you to encourage you to challenge them, to contradict them based on your own experiences, or if they seem right to you, to confirm them. I really am viewing this webinar as a chance to test some of these observations with people who've been involved in this sort of peer learning. Some of these observations, many of them I would say, didn't seem surprising to us at all, but rather were more a confirmation of what we thought we already knew. A few were a little less expected. In all cases, your input will really help to shape them further. So I'm not going to go through this list right now because I have a separate slide for each of these observations. You can read through them right here, but I'm going to move on to the next slide. So one thing that was actually a little bit surprising to us was that we actually found relatively few organizations that had a long-term focus on transatlantic peer learning, and even fewer that were significantly focused on older industrial cities. So we looked at efforts as far back as the EPA-funded International Brownfields Exchange, which was started in 1998 by the Toronto Waterfront Regeneration Trust, as well as the US-German bilateral working group, out of which this network here grew, and then all the way up to very recent efforts, such as the just launched Transatlantic Cities of Tomorrow program of the American Council on Germany. And even so, we found, in the range of 10 to 12 organizations that really focused on sort of programming it that ran across 1 or more years related to these issues. One possible exception to this, I'm going to come back to this later, in universities and other research institutions. There were actually an awful lot of universities and research institutions active in this area, and for reasons that I'll describe later, it was quite a bit more difficult to pin them down and track down those efforts. But in terms of non-academic practitioner-focused efforts, there were very few organizations. So then we began to think about why. And, I suppose one potential reason one might think is that people just aren't interested. But given the number of one-off study tours that do seem to take place, I really don't believe that lack of interest on the part of participants is the issue. So one possible reason might be that longer-term programming tends to involve a larger number of cities or regions. If that programming runs over more than 1 year, often the cities that are involved change from year to year, and that this may make it difficult to find, for example, local or regional funding for the program. Local or regional funders may not be interested at all, or they may be interested only in that tiny piece of the program that relates to their city or their region, which means there's simply a smaller pool of funders to fall back on. And that is certainly something that I have experienced in my work, also with the German Marshall Fund, this tension between local funding and more national funding or international funding. I'm going to come back to this other question mark in a second. I'm going to have my first moment where I'm going to ask specifically for your input. But first, I just want to very quickly ask sort of why this even matters. Why are we so concerned with this longer term program as opposed to one-off efforts, and why are we noticing that there's so few and think that's a matter for concern? I guess one, I would pose again more as a hypothesis that these longer-term programs are more likely to produce outcomes because they enable repeated exposure to particular ideas. As any of you who have been on study tours or other exchanges know, one of the first reactions is, well, that's a great idea, but there's no way that that would work at home, whether that's because of the legal framework or political concerns or whatever it might be. But with repeated meetings and repeated convenings and exposure to that particular idea, it is easier to break down some of those barriers and to allow time for participants to work jointly on how to adapt particular policy ideas to different contexts. Also important, and this is something that our conversations through this project have borne out very clearly, is that longer term programs are able to build in mechanisms for tracking outcomes over time. And this is obviously very important for seeking new funding or renewed funding. So I'd like to go back to this other, and I know this is a pretty small group and I may not be able to get you all to join in and speak about this, but I'd love to ask if anyone else is surprised by what we found, which is relatively few organizations aside from universities and research institutions that are working on sustained programming around transatlantic peer learning, and what the reasons for that might be. Again, if you want to speak, you have to unmute yourself, so please keep that in mind. All right, no one? Okay, I'll keep going then. Again, just to reiterate that this is really intended to be an interactive session, so please do interrupt. Okay, another observation from this project so far relates to the theme of peer learning activities. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy really asked us to look into peer learning opportunities that related to older industrial cities. We've already expanded that a little bit to look at activities that involved older industrial cities, even if they weren't specifically targeted at them. But nonetheless, we found a low and possibly decreasing number of peer learning activities for practitioners that were really focused on older industrial cities. And so we wondered what the reasons for this might be. And among the reasons that we are considering, and this project is obviously still underway, which is why so many of these are framed as questions, and which is why we wanted to have this webinar for you all to provide input. Among the possible reasons is that there's actually currently potentially less need among European cities. We've heard from a number of the people that we've spoken with that the larger older industrial cities in Europe are on the path to recovery, and that possibly for that reason, the urgency around this programming no longer seems so great, at least among European cities. I would state that I don't think that's the case in the US. However, in the US, when we spoke to people, we definitely heard that there's a discomfort with being labeled part of this group. Often the labels are not particularly positive. And so that this might be part of the reason why there's been a shift away from peer learning activities focused specifically on older industrial cities to peer learning activities that are organized around thematic or policy areas that might involve older industrial cities, but for example, are dealing with questions of sustainability or energy or workforce policies. And then finally, just a shift in funder interests is always, of course, a possibility for the reason. So I am going to make one more attempt to have you all join in here. I'm going to make many more attempts, actually, but this is my next one. And see, again, if this rings true to you all, that the number of peer learning activities specifically focused on older industrial cities seems to be possibly decreasing, and what the reasons for that would be. And Sarah, I see that you have your microphone on, so I'm hoping you're ready to jump in here.
Yes, can you hear me okay, Tamar?
I can, and
okay.
Welcome. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Yes, good morning from the West Coast.
Yeah, so, up early.
Yeah. 7:18 a.m. So this is great. I was concerned that my microphone wasn't working, so I was actually getting ready to type in. One question, and for the rest of the group, my name is Sarah Seeloff. I'm coming to you from Oakland, California, and I lead a national nonprofit in the U.S. called the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Tamar, when you talk about the decrease in transatlantic exchange activities, I'm just wondering how many of the European post-industrial cities who've been very active in this space are in Germany, and how much could the distance between the present day and German reunification have to do with that decrease, i.e. perhaps there was more demand for transatlantic exchange when German reunification was like a major policy issue that had to be worked through and cities were really looking for answers? And are we just seeing kind of a natural, I guess, attenuation now that we're, 30-something years in the future?
Well,
so just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so possibly, except just to clarify, what we have seen just in this little piece of research is a decreasing number of peer learning activities that were really specifically focused on older industrial cities. We haven't necessarily seen a reduction, I would say, in peer learning activities, whether that's between other countries in Europe and the US or Germany and the US. It's just that they don't seem to be targeted at that particular sort of type of geography anymore. They may include that type of geography, but they don't seem to be targeted at it. And that may not be sort of hugely relevant for a practitioner sitting on either side of the ocean, thinking about what their opportunities are for participating in an exchange. But the scope of this project at the beginning was to really look into peer learning around older industrial cities. And there seems to have been sort of I would say a high point in that activity, roughly sort of between 2008 and 2012. And that seems to be decreasing. But I mean, it's an interesting idea that you're raising, but I don't necessarily see a reduction, for example, in interest in peer learning around, let's say, workforce issues or sustainability issues.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Thank you.
And we had another person, Mark, you also wanted, I hope, get in on the conversation.
Can you hear me all right then?
Yes.
I was having a little trouble. Perfect. So I'm Merrick Gutman. I'm at the Brookings Institution in DC, and I oversee, among other things in the portfolio, our Global Cities Initiative for the past 7 years, which has been about 2/3 focused on US city regions, and then about 15 interactions with 15 places internationally with which we've interacted with various degrees. Couple of things, feedback on actually the first question where I was trying to get in.
Sorry about that.
No, it was my fault. I couldn't get my mic to work well. So it's not surprising to me that there are lack of the kinds of activities you're describing, but there is a redundancy and overwhelming number of city-type networks in place now. And I think that the dilution effect may have a significant impact on these kind of ongoing, deeper peer learning, kind of cohort-based activities. Find that the biggest places, the top 5 in the country, have the institutional resources and expertise to engage on these topics in multiple ways. But when you get down to the places that really need to have these exchanges, the mid-sized cities that are the most often those that are kind of either the lagging regions in the European community or the older industrial cities tag in the United States, they have personnel issues, they have prioritization issues, they have lack of money. And so there's one question about the overabundance of networks and what they're doing. Second one is to your point about the structural issues of transferability within systems. I agree that there are many things that can be adapted over time. We've seen that processes and kind of policy or programmatic concepts being adapted, but it is pretty fundamental about so depending upon, again, who your audience is for these activities, it's pretty fundamental what authorities are at the city or city region level, who's participating. We have situations where, mayors there are cities that we interact with internationally that don't even have mayors, right? So those can't be underestimated. And then I think another element is the breadth of topics being addressed. So if you go, a lot of these activities they lack boundaries, or they mean all things to all people, and therefore the value that the cities find from those engagements is somewhat diminished. So I just wanted to offer up those quick reactions, and I'll hold for other feedback on this latest one if you want.
Well, I actually have one quick follow-up question for you, but first I agree with you on all your points, and I actually will coming later to a slide about this question of what one can transfer easily and what one really cannot, given some of the structural differences that you referenced. And I also will talk a little bit about sort of the breadth of topics and how that can be dealt with, because I agree on that point as well, that it's difficult it's often difficult to structure these activities so they are really directly relevant to what someone in the city is working on, for example. But when you talk about this sort of the plethora of networks, I'd love to know what sorts of networks you are talking about. Again, that wasn't so much, we were looking more at the sort of cohort-based intensive learning, but I'd love to know which networks you think are sort of taking people's attention potentially away from some of more intensive.
Well, people estimate somewhere between 200 and 300 different networks, and the question about, and they're not intensive necessarily. They're more general information exchange. There are relatively regular meetings, but everybody has limited time to dedicate, and these cohort activities in which we find most effective and we're most involved in kind of trying to facilitate, that requires a really heavy commitment and a really long period of time. And so it's not necessarily that there's a direct competitor for that activity, but the diversity of networks, the diversity of opportunities to feel like you're engaging with counterparts internationally is very high. And so the choices that are being made between, okay, well, I'll be involved in the Welcoming Cities Network versus I'll go over and try to get into the U20, or I will be part of yet another smart cities engagement. That kind of stuff is very distracting. So making the choices, even if these activities exist, to be involved in this kind of pure learning effort just becomes more complicated.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to come back to some of these points as I keep going. So please jump in again if you have any other, additional thoughts on this. But that was really helpful. So last point on this slide, I guess in relation to my suspicion, or what folks have mentioned to us in a lot of the interviews we have, that there is the sense among the larger, and by larger, I don't mean large, but sort of the mid-sized European cities, older industrial cities, that they are well on their way to recovery, and that perhaps there's less need, therefore. That still leaves an entire universe of smaller cities that both in the US and in Europe are in desperate need of new strategies and new innovations. As Merrick said, they are often not the cities that have either the personnel and certainly not the funds in order to easily participate in programming like this. But that's, of course, precisely why some of these longer-term sustained and funded programs are so important, because then cities who themselves would not be able to support this sort of work can, in fact, take part. And then the other exception I have listed here is around research and academic collaborations. So the point of the slide, again, was that there seemed to be a decreasing interest in this question of getting older industrial cities together. That there does not seem to be, based on our conversations that we've been having, any significant reduction in research interest, particularly in Europe, I would say, around older industrial cities. So I'm going to come back to the academic side on another slide, but I just wanted to highlight that here as well. All right, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly and then move on to the next slide, but they actually do relate to something we were just talking about. So, again, we've seen this sort of interest in sustained programming with cohorts meeting repeatedly over 1 or more years. This is a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because of course for this project we specifically said we're not looking at one-off study tours. So of course what we found was an interest in sustained programming. But nonetheless, we wanted to note it here that it's not just that organizations want to host study tours over a course of 3 years, but they actually are expecting cities to participate themselves repeatedly over 1 or more years to have that kind of repeated convening of the same participants. I would say, just as some examples here, these are not exclusive at all, but pretty much all recent GMF programming of the study tour variety has followed this model. The new American Council on Germany program that some of you may have seen announced, the Transatlantic Cities of Tomorrow program, also follows this model. The next point is that we've seen sort of an uptick in interest in project-based programming, and this, to some extent, addresses the point, Merrick, that you were making about the breadth of topics being addressed. That has been a challenge, I think, for all of these efforts. And the response seems to be, well, let's tie this work directly to projects that participants are working on. Often those projects are actually part of the selection process for people to even participate, or for cities to participate. It usually goes beyond the cities because it's relevant to the specific individuals participating, so that all the learning can be tied directly to a project that is currently underway in cities. One example of this, I would say, would be GMF's Dialogues for Change program, which I'm not trying to show any favoritism towards GMF here. That actually occurred after my departure from GMF. But I think it's a great example of a program that really tried to tie the learning specifically to projects that participants from both sides of the Atlantic had to bring to the table. And then the final one is, and I've already mentioned this briefly, is that there definitely seems to be more of a focus on programming according to policy area, not geography. Again, this may be an attempt to deal with this question of breadth, not to say, well, older industrial cities are in the same situation, so let's bring them all together and surely they'll learn something, but rather to narrow the focus down to, let's say, workforce or sustainability, though that's of course still very broad. And I just have a couple examples listed here. The Transatlantic Cities of Tomorrow program is focused on digitalization and the future of work, for example. So these are just 3 trends that we have observed in our research so far. This is a slide where I'm actually going to pause and hope that people really jump in again. And again, this goes back to something that Merrick said. It's the question of what can and what cannot be transferred particularly easily. So there's in our conversations with people, we've sort of noted that the examples that we've been given of solutions that have been adapted to new contexts successfully tend to be quite technical in nature rather than systemic or policy approaches. So, technical transportation innovations, some work around brownfield remediation or adaptive reuse, specific projects rather than policies. Again, not surprising. Obviously, systemic or policy approaches are much harder to transfer given different legal contexts, legal frameworks, political contexts, all of it. Nevertheless, I wanted to stop here for a minute and open up the conversation just to see if you all had any counterexamples, because I would absolutely love to know of successful examples of adaptation of a systemic or policy approach. And I'd also love your thoughts on how programs could be structured to better support and facilitate this sort of transfer while recognizing that it will involve a lot of adaptation, obviously, because of the different contexts. And then finally, how this transfer practices could be more effectively tracked and documented. I suspect not only that these technical solutions are frankly easier to adapt, but also that they're easier to document because they're sort of more of a one-to-one translation in a sense. And I'd just love to see if anybody has any thoughts on any of these three questions. Again, I'm always on the lookout for great examples of transfer of systemic or policy approaches. Hang on one second. I have to set my mic so I can see. No one? No good examples of where you would say, I learned about this policy and, oh, Merrick, I saw that your mic went on again. You can't get off of it that easily.
Well, I was trying to give other people an opportunity. So, I think, we've been focused a lot more on economic issues than on, so I completely agree. Obviously, technical solutions, project-based stuff, or even commented on systemic policy challenges because the resources are different, the levels of authority are different. And a couple of things that even in the United States, where we have very different assignments of roles and fiscal ability to draw on local fiscal capabilities determined by states and so all that stuff. Because some common themes are economic governance. So whatever your system is, what's the role of the private sector and the public sector? And how do we distribute, or how can everybody contribute to common objectives? What are the common characteristics, particularly in these older industrial cities, that make the transition more successful? So if you look and say that they have a significant investment in anchoring around higher end research universities, then the response might be to increase the ability of the research universities to engage with the local economy, or to bolster existing universities to do more of the kinds of things that generate economic activity to help these cities in transition. So there are a couple of those higher level strategy discussions about what notwithstanding the systems that are in place, what kinds of policy decisions generally can influence direction. And then you have to do problem solving within your existing set of stakeholders in order to go to implementation. And there's like the bridge between a process for analyzing and adopting higher level strategies, and then the super tactical stuff about these are the best ways to approach a transportation solution around transit development, things, those kinds of things. So I think that the process for problem solving is something we've found to be more successful, and you can pick and choose how you apply the general strategy approaches to your local tactical circumstances.
Yeah. Would you say that the work around innovation districts that Brookings has done has been an example of sort of successful transposing of models across different contexts, different countries?
Debatable. You know, I think yeah, we have differing, and even inside books, we have differing
Yeah.
opinions about, you know, the innovation districts and what they're, how they're being defined, and, you know, are they just a label versus what's distinctive about them. I think that represents some of the characteristics. We talk a lot about innovation ecosystems, right? So separate from innovation districts, we're a little bit tied up around the geography of that stuff, districts. So I think that the ability to transfer knowledge and adapt your economy, there are lots of different ways. I think those are where we found some commonalities. I think the concept of international business engagement and how you work more effectively with smaller and mid-sized businesses to take advantage of international opportunities, notwithstanding the current dialogue. Those kinds of strategy processes have been very transferable. So what we've done in the US has been adapted in Canada and in London and in Stockholm and so on. So I think there are some things that there's some very specific examples of policy or economic orientation that's been adapted. I think the problem we have with some of that innovation district and infrastructure type stuff is the financing mechanisms. And the United States doesn't look like Europe. Europe actually has some greater flexibility than the US does in terms of certain kinds of financing. So,
Yeah.
but there are examples.
Thanks. Sarah, I saw you briefly had your microphone on. You're gone again. Was there something you were trying to say?
Well, I had one example where I can say that I may have a lead for you, and I'm happy to connect you with people who would know more than I. We did some work in early 2018 with the Minnesota Brownfield Association, and they have a particularly robust relationship with a nonprofit group out of the UK called CLAIR, CL:8IR. And if you ask me what that stands for, I'll be totally lost. But the bottom line is that those two groups have worked together very closely on issues of fill or reuse of contaminated soil as fill. The UK has a pretty aggressive policy framework for dealing with some of these more technical brownfield remediation issues. But I think if you back up and look at this in a larger context, it really does represent something of a philosophical shift and ties in with some of the current discussions being had in the US and elsewhere about green remediation. And I know that this was particularly significant to Minnesota brownfields because they were doing some pretty aggressive state level advocacy on the topic. So, excuse me, I am not the expert on that. I simply had the good fortune to be around that very robust exchange, but I'm happy to follow up with you offline if that's something that you're interested in pursuing further. I could connect you with the right people. So just to say that I suppose that example really echoes what you were saying earlier, Tamar, about the ease with which, or relative frequency with which we can transfer some of these more technical approaches, but that there are kind of echoes, I think, in that example of sort of larger strategic policy approaches and, shift.
Yes? I see a microphone on, but maybe not. All right, well, I will keep moving on. Hang on, I'm being told I have some messages in the chat box. Okay, so maybe there's no microphone on his computer. All right. Okay, David, you still want to say something? Apparently you should be able to talk now, I'm being told.
Yes.
Okay,
Hi.
great, it worked. Hello, go ahead.
So David and I were looking, this is Carla Mays, I'm with David here. We were discussing that a lot of.
Just so people on the line know who you're with.
Sure. We happen to be in Miami today. We run a program called Smart Cohort, which focuses on equitable, smart, and resilient cities development. We have San Francisco as our main hub, and we have 8 cities around North America. And today we happen to be in Miami with our Smart Miami chapter. And some of the challenges that we're finding as we travel around and we do a lot of this work is the divorcing of the technical. Can it be done? Absolutely. Are there a lot of social and economic challenges to being able to do this work? And what we've been doing is, doing active research on working with the public sector on understanding first what some frameworks are. So we work with United States Green Building Council, eco districts, form-based codes is a new one we just started working with. We've been working with American Society of Public Administrators in writing about managing the smart and resilient city. And so we've been looking at the integrated approaches to doing this work. And some of the challenges is that there just isn't, these things haven't coalesced together. And there's the academic research has not come together in an approach that has coalesced. And so we've been here lately working with beginning to put together Paul Herman's work, ESG portfolio work, along with Betty Yee, who's the controller of the state of California, in being able to look at how do we do this better? Because in the communities where we have remediation going on, it immediately sparks with a lot of gentrification. And then you're talking about the existing community who benefits from remediation. Those are a lot of questions that we're starting to look at. Here in Miami, that's a big problem. Areas like in Miami, the Wynwood district of the city of Miami, and the Overtown, which is a community development district. These are areas that had a lot of brownfields. As they've been cleaned up, we've started to see a lot of tower, high-rise developments, high-density developments. And then the question becomes remediation for whom? And then a lot of the challenges around the city of Miami and not getting a lot of federal dollars, in being federal dollars deprived. And so David's a millennial policy commissioner here in Miami-Dade, and so I'll let him take it from there.
Yeah, and let me clarify one thing first, which is I agree entirely with what you're saying, and maybe I should have said this, but to some extent, I think if you participate in this sort of transatlantic learning, you know that anything that you're taking for an idea that you're taking from elsewhere has to be adapted to your particular context. And obviously, the sort of social issues and social governance issues that you're describing and concerns about gentrification are top of the list among the sorts of challenges that have to be kept in mind when you're adapting an idea from elsewhere to the U.S. That's, I would say, is no different from when if you come up with an idea just sort of out of the blue, or if it's an idea that you're taking from some other U.S. city. In either case, whether international or whether domestic, those issues have to be taken into account. But I think that's less part of the sort of initial transfer of the idea. That's more how do you adapt it to your local context, and that is always critical.
So this is where David and I have been working on. There's not enough Americans that actually do this work, that actually are able to go to Europe and see this, see the examples up close, and that's where the adaptation tends to go.
So I'm a millennial policy commissioner for Miami-Dade County. We oversee 34 municipalities, and I'm leading all of the new policy initiatives for our age demographic. So born after 1980. I'm doing everything from infrastructure to land use to housing to transportation to jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Carla and I met Stefan and the team from Germany at Smart Cities New York inaugural conference in May of 2017. We were part of their summer workshop with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which took place at the U.S. Green Building Council HQ in Washington, D.C. this past July. And we are a do tank that focuses on equitable, smart, and resilient cities by doing capacity building, training, and action research. Not just what we're looking at is Americans don't have the necessary support or resources to go to Europe and other places and learn best practices. We don't have that. And then the lens, there's not many Americans in this space that are looking at the intersection of planning, sustainability, governance, finance, and architecture. Our Western focus has been more on technology deployments. And like you said, transferring from city to city through peer learning without really looking at the governance as it is tied to investments and demographics. So really what we were talking about in the text box was, yes, we have to be mindful of gentrification displacement, but we're also looking at how do we have, how are we engaging folks who have expertise and reflect these refugee, people of color, indigenous, millennial communities in Europe and the United States at the design table, these research groups, these collaboratives, the folks that are writing the frameworks, and how do we get the necessary funding to be able to go to these executive programs, research presentations, conferences,
And just to bring
our research to Europe and bring that type of knowledge sharing and expertise.
In that many organizations that appear to be doing it with you, that there's more support. And so I absolutely agreed with that. And it's something that, you know, again, hopefully we can take back and then can help shape future work and maybe even some additional future support. But agreed entirely.
Yeah.
And not for us, for many people that are left out of the conversation.
Absolutely. It's often a very narrow conversation. I absolutely agree with you. It really is often not only very narrow, but it's often also very subdivided. So you have the researchers doing their thing on one side. You've got, you know, city officials doing their thing. You've got nonprofits and sort of separate exchanges. So not only is it often quite limited, but it's also quite subdivided. So I would absolutely.
So one of the things we do at Smart Cohort and that capacity building is bringing the nonprofit, the research community, the different pillars within government, and the business and research community together.
Yeah.
And have some sort of an understanding and framework, and how did they build that collaboration so that we don't have those silos when we move to a technical or finance phase.
Yeah.
And so we bring things like the transportation camp and eco districts training and the like. So there are new models of collaboration, of getting past the sector divides.
Yeah.
And things of that nature. And we've been very successful at doing so and seeing that, you know, we can move forward in being an adaptation. So one of the projects here in Miami was the Miami Tunnel Project. It was a remediation of a site, and then they're going to be the first one of the climate adaptive ports. And so we're seeing great projects that are coming along. And so I would say you were asking for examples, and I would say the Miami Port and the tunnel project is one of the best examples of this.
Okay. All right. I'm aware of the time. We're actually getting towards the end. I'm almost at the end of my presentation too. Just a couple more quick slides. The first is I sort of separated out, according to the conversation we were just having, perhaps I shouldn't have, but I separated out the researcher exchanges because they do seem to often happen quite separately. And I wanted to just make a few points. One is that I'd mentioned that among practitioner exchanges, the interest specifically in older industrial cities seemed to perhaps be decreasing. That does not seem to be true among research institutions and university partnerships. I just have a few sort of examples listed here. There's a nice sort of active exchange going on between universities in Dortmund and in St. Louis around challenges that those two cities face. There's an effort, a new effort, which is really targeted at building the network of researchers focused on these issues called ReCity Innovative Training Network. It's a EU-funded program that's going to support PhD candidates to do research around shrinking cities issues. And there's all sorts of student exchanges between universities. I've just listed one example here. A point I wanted to make about this, the researcher peer learning, is that the partnerships seem to grow very organically from out of the international research community. And that is a luxury that practitioners don't really have, because there is no international practitioner community in that sense. And so there seem to be just far more really quite informal and yet sustained and serious partnerships among researchers and institutions, often harder to track because they were so informal in nature. The practitioner community, because there is no existing sort of place where people meet, the conferences don't tend to be international, with, you know, perhaps through those networks that Merrick was mentioning earlier, but sort of in-person meetings are more difficult, particularly given funding. The practitioner side, I think, requires more hand-holding and more support and more funding. A couple more points on research, and I don't know if we have a lot of researchers on the line, but the products from some of these partnerships are obviously joint conference presentations, also joint research. But one of the things that was raised with us repeatedly in conversations, two things really. One is that data comparability is a concern for transatlantic research, and related to that, because data comparability is a concern, a lot of the research is a little bit more case study based, sort of the joint transatlantic research. And there was some concern that the recognition for this sort of case study based research within academia was not so high, which then served as a disincentive to do more of it. So I don't know if anybody else has had that experience, but that's something that we've been hearing from people. Yeah.
So some of the reasons why this is happening is the demographics of both the United States and North America and Europe are changing. We're not having enough diversity on the research teams, in the PhD programs, in the policy positions, in these funding fellowships like is Horizon 2020, Marie Curie, et cetera. The lack of diversity isn't in that, then doesn't match the implementation strategies, which then doesn't match the finance, which is why we don't see these sustainable solutions scale.
It comes down to
I want to make sure that other people have a chance to talk to, but I do hear you, and I do think part of the solution is also to break down the distinction between the research and the practitioner exchanges, and to diversify both, absolutely, but also bring them together so that you have the researchers working. And of course, many research efforts do that and have done that. I mean, one example, one of the, the Weak Market Cities program, not so much with regard to diversity, but with regard to bringing practitioners and researchers together. It certainly made a point of doing that so that the researchers were working with those people on the ground who would then be implementing. But again, you're absolutely right. It tends to then sort of stop with city leadership rather than including a broader range of the populations who are impacted by some of what we're talking about here. So I do absolutely agree with that. So with that, I've come to sort of the end of my presentation. We're also almost out of time. We really have just, at this point, about 4 minutes left. So I guess what I'd like to do is, if anyone who hasn't spoken yet would like to say something, I would like to encourage you to do that now. If not, because we really don't have more time, I would encourage any of you to reach out to me with further thoughts. I have my email listed here. I have just some questions which were meant to guide a discussion loosely. We don't really have time for a discussion at this point anymore, but if you'd like to send me thoughts, I would welcome those thoughts. My email is below. But again, if anybody who hasn't spoken yet has a sort of a last thought on anything we've discussed so far or on these questions, this is your chance to speak up. All right. Well, in that case, if no one wants to add any more, I guess I will just say a big thank you to you all for the participation and for the ideas that you've given me. And again, encourage you to reach out to me if you have further thoughts on any of this. And I'd like to say a big thank you again to Stefan and to the network for enabling this webinar to take place. Really appreciate your time, and I wish you all a very good day, however much of it you have left. We over here don't have so much of it left. But for those of you who still have the day ahead of you, wishing you a very good day. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Tamer. Thanks a lot to all of you for joining in our discussion. To Sarah and David, who we're seeing at the moment. We are looking back here. Andrea next to me, whom we are today with in her local agency, and next to us, Tamer sitting. Very big applause virtually and here in the room to you. And stay in contact with Tamer. To stay in contact in this group, I warmly invite you to go to de-us.net to become a member of that site. It's absolutely free, but it gives you the opportunity to stay in contact with us and to further elaborate on the topics that we discussed here. Also, we are planning, you saw the question by David in the chat maybe, what are next activities. We are currently setting up a real live meeting going to be end of June in Germany. So if you are interested in any more specific information about that, come to our site, join our network, and we'll keep you posted about the outcomes and future webinars on DeusNet. You can also find the recent webinars of DeusNet online. Thanks for today. Have a nice day as Tamer left for whatever it is left of it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.